Hello everyone, and welcome back to Kerbal Space Program Expert Mode, the series where I make everything way harder than it needs to be for absolutely no discernible reason. This is my second video on this challenge, so if you haven't seen the first one, you can go do that, but the gist is that I use some creative design decisions to make do with very limited science and funding, and manage to land on the moon and Minmus. This time I'll be expanding to the other planets of the Kerbaler system, researching new technologies, and sending Jeb where no Kerbal has gone before. Now, where were we?
My Rouges. Why Dune?
Naturally, after exploring Kerbin's moons, I've set my sights on Dooner as the first interplanetary destination. But in order to get there, we need to talk about transfer windows. If you remember when I went to the moon last time, I needed to start burning at the right point in my orbit so that when I reached apoapsis, the moon would, actually be there to get an encounter with. Interplanetary transfers are similar, but Kerbin has to be in the right point on its orbit as well. If you've ever watched a MacLeod video, you might know that Kerbin has to be about 45 degrees behind Duna for an optimal transfer. But we can be more precise with the Transfer Window Planner mod. Just enter where you are and where you want to be, then behold, the pork chop plot. The horizontal axis shows when to leave Kerbin, the vertical axis shows when to arrive at Duna, and all the funny colors show how much delta V it takes to get there. This dark blue area represents the lowest delta V cost, so that's where I want to make my transfer. And I have about 126 days before it's here, so I'd better get to work. Before going to Duna, there's some preparations I want to make. I'll start by sending another mission to Minmus's Flats. There, Bob tries out the EVA science kit I just unlocked, as well as grabs a green sandstone to take back to Kerbin for analysis. I also take some contracts to rescue more astronauts, welcoming scientist Maubert and pilot Murdrin to the team. Next, it's time to get some more money. Last episode, I sent Val to a polar orbit around the moon for like 2 weeks to do temperature and pressure surveys for some contracts. This was quite profitable, but ultimately limited by the fact that I had to bring her back to Kerbin, because Kerbinauts are expensive, or at least the rockets I use to rescue them are, and I can only have so many at a time. So I'll take a note from every other tech company nowadays and replace my workers with AI. After researching electrics to unlock the Octo probe core and some solar panels, I'll build the Lunar Orbital Research Probe, or MORP for short. However, because of the difficulty settings I willingly chose to play with, probes need an antenna connection to be controllable, which means that I get to explain how ComNet works. First, the probes needs to be within comms range of Kerbin. The range itself depends on the combined power of the antenna on the craft, level of the tracking station, and the antenna range modifier option, which, of course, I've set to 10%. What I have right now can just barely connect from Minmus, but any further than that and probes aren't really feasible. Second, the craft needs to have a line of sight to the KSC, or to another one of the ground stations on Kerbin. Normally, the game is pretty generous in terms of letting you communicate through the surface of a planet. This makes things a bit easier, as well as simulates how in real life radio waves can refract through the atmosphere to reach further around the Earth. However, I have occlusion modifier set to 1.0, so I won't be getting any of that leeway. One fun effect of this is that there are dead zones in low Kerbin orbit where all the ground stations are below the horizon, so my probe becomes uncontrollable. Regardless, the MORP 1 inserts into a polar moon orbit and begins paying dividends. I'll also launch the MORP 2 to Minmus where it can do the same, additionally serving as a target to rendezvous with for another contract. Afterwards, I can land in the Greater Flats for some more science. Using the funds I've acquired from completing contracts, I can upgrade the VAB to level 2, allowing me to build much more complex rockets. No longer limited, 30 parts, I can build the Calico 4, which has more delta V for biome hopping, and launch it to Minmus. After encountering some spatial anomalies at Minmus's South Pole, I decided it would be best to hop over to the Highlands for some more science. The Calico 4 also features a docking port, which I'll use to dock with the MORP 2 on the way back for another contract. With the next 2 launches, I can perform a crew transfer in Minmus orbit, then land in the Lesser Flats, the last biome I haven't visited yet. With Minmus fully explored, it's time to turn my attention back to the moon. After another docking and crew transfer, I'll send missions to the East Crater, Farside Crater, East Farside Crater, Midland Craters, Twin Craters, and the Lowlands. I'm starting to think that the moon has too many craters. Anyways, with all that science, I can research heavy rocketry, advanced construction, landing, and advanced flight control, unlocking the last parts I'll need to go for a Dooner mission. And just in time too, because our transfer window is almost here. Getting to Dooner isn't that much harder than a moon landing, at least not if you don't mind sticking Jeb in a pod for 2 years, but it'll still require the most powerful rocket I've built so far. First, I'll build the direct descent lander, using the 1.8 meter command pod to carry 2 Kerbals to Dooner and back. It'll also have every experiment I've unlocked, as well as the Terrier engine, which happens to be quite well optimized for Dooner's atmosphere. For the interplanetary transfer itself, I'll add an upper stage with the Poodle engine, as that has good thrust and high specific impulse for vacuum burns. Finally, a core stage with a skipper engine, surrounded by 4 Thumper SRBs, will launch the whole thing into orbit. With that, the Ginger 1 is ready for launch, and Jeb and Bill are locked in for their biggest mission yet. I want to make the most of this transfer window, so after the Ginger 1 departs for Dooner, I'll launch Val and Bob on the Ginger 2. The rocket itself is identical to its predecessor, but its destination will be Dooner's moon, Ike. Because of how the transfers work out, it'll get there a bit quicker than the Ginger 1. Bob wastes no time collecting all the science he can. To save fuel on capturing into orbit, I'll engage in some interplanetary aerobraking. Dooner's atmosphere is very thin, so I'll need to lower my periapsis to just over 20 kilometers to get a useful amount of drag. Still cooling off, the Ginger 2 can capture into Ike orbit, then go for a landing in the lowlands. And now, it's time for the main event. Jeb and Bill arrive in the Dooner system and, a few aerobraking passes later, capture into a low orbit. I'll be using the parachutes to help land, so it's important to lower the minimum pressure so they can deploy in Dooner's atmosphere. Oh, and in case you forgot, G-force tolerances are still set to 1%. Luckily, Jeb wakes up just in time to start the landing burn. As per usual, Jeb goes on EVA to plant a flag. Meanwhile, Bill's job as an engineer is to repack the parachute so that I can reuse them for the Kerbin return. Afterwards, I'll check out this blueberry formation near the lander. Interesting stuff, but I have a contract to collect a Duna stone, so I'll look for one of those as well. Nope. Nope. Not there. Still looking. Aha! Now that I've found one, Bill just has to walk all the way there. But eventually he reaches the Duna stone, so we'll have him pick it up and... Oh god fucking damn it! Okay, so Bill takes the Duna stone all the way back to the lander. Luckily, there's another blueberry formation not too far away, so we'll have him grab that to take home as well. Speaking of, let's work on that whole getting home part. Ascending from Duna, I can take my gravity turn much more aggressively than I can on Kerbin, eventually circularizing at about 60 kilometers. With 900 meters per second left in the tank, Jeb and Bill won't be stranded today. Meanwhile, back on Ike, the Ginger 2 has some fuel to spare. I don't know about you, but I think some biome hopping is in order. A short hop to the west puts us in the Midlands, where Bob can get some more science, and another hop from there gets us to the eastern mountain ridge. Here, I spot a Duna Ejecta, which I have another contract to collect. It is all the way up the mountain though, so it's time for Bob to do some low-gravity hiking. And since he's almost there anyways, I'll have him climb up to the very summit and plant the flag. After that, it's time for the Ginger 2 to depart Ike. This mission has been very productive, but there's one more milestone I want to hit while I'm here, which is docking in Duna orbit. I'll eject from Ike and do some more aerobraking to rendezvous the craft. From there, docking isn't too hard, just point the ports at each other and make sure not to do this. I get it on the second try though, so the crew will get to hang out together while they wait on the Kerbin return window. After another year or so, it's time to get my Kerbals on the way back to Kerbin. It's about 600 meters per second to eject from Duna, and like before, the Ginger 2 makes it home first. I put it on a pretty shallow re-entry, so it skips off the atmosphere like a rock before landing. The Ginger 1 follows soon after, just make sure to set the parachutes back to normal before re-entry. All told, the Ginger missions collected over 600 science points and made over 200,000 funds. That's what I call a mission success.
They have a quote during the loading screen, hey, we're doing this, we're doing that just says, never visiting Dres. Because why would you? It's just a rock.
Lately, rumors have been spreading among the people of Kerbin about some kind of mysterious planet between the orbits of Duna and Jewel. Now, I've never heard of such a thing, but for the sake of science, I've decided to send a mission to investigate. There's just one small problem. I can't actually unlock any of the parts I need without upgrading research and development. And even with all the funds I've made, I still can't afford it. So while the 4 veterans are on leave after returning from Duna, I'll have the B team of Kerbinauts I picked up from orbit last episode work on making some money. But first, I get a contract to put a satellite in Minmus orbit, so I'll build the Morph 3. I'll also add 2 relay antennae, so the probe will hopefully be able to help with comms on the far side of Minmus. It's nice to actually have fairings now, so I don't have to shove the probe in a cargo bay like I did last time. While that's on the way, I take some more contracts to conduct surveys of the moon and Minmus. Temperature surveys are nothing Morph 1 and 2 can't handle, but observational surveys require a crewed mission, so I'll send up Merger on a Kit 7 I had lying around to get those. While she orbits Minmus, I'll research some new parts, unlocking some deployable science experiments from the BreakingGround-DLC. To get them to space, I'll assemble the Calico 5, a lander capable of carrying 3 Kerbals and some cargo to either of Kerbin's moons and back. I'll also add an extra crew cabin to raise the maximum capacity to 5, enough to meet the requirements for a surface outpost contract. To launch it to Minmus, I can reuse some technology from the Ginger rockets. The Calico 5 touches down in Minmus's Greater Flats. After Gia does some jetpacking to get EVA surveys, the crew gets to work assembling Minmus Base Alpha. First, Gia deploys the experiment control station, which needed to connect back to Kerbin. Then Gleamorgan set up the solar panels, which produce more power when deployed by an engineer. Finally, scientist Maubert can deploy the Goob ED monitor experiment, which will be able to transmit science back to Kerbin over time. At this point, I finally have enough cash to upgrade R&D, which not only allows me to research more advanced technology, but also allows Kerbal to take surface samples on EVA. This goes into effect immediately, so with the help of some biome hopping, the Calico 5 can get samples from the Greater Flats, Lowlands, Slopes, Midlands, and Highlands. At 15 science each, this is definitely the best experiment I've unlocked so far. It would have really been nice to have it for Duna and Ike, but I digress. As the Calico 5 returns to Kerbin, Murdrin goes on another solo mission, this time to get some EVA reports from the moon for her contract. While she's there, I can also get surface samples from the moon's Highlands and Midlands. Then, I'll launch another Calico 5 to complete a contract for a station in moon orbit, and land it in the Northeast Basin to collect science and deploy some more surface experiments. Okay, it's probably time to figure out how I'll be getting the Dres. To cover development costs, I'll launch another Calico 5 to get surveys from the moon's Highlands. Landing site is right next to the polar crater, which is a biome I haven't visited yet, so I'm tempted to hop over for some additional science, but I know I only have barely enough fuel to return to Kerbin, so I'll just head home. For now, at least. Then, I can research precision propulsion, heavier rocketry, specialized construction, command modules, and advanced electrics. Using all these new parts, I'll build the Tabby, an advanced crew capsule launched aboard a more powerful rocket. Look, it even has a launch escape system to convince the crew that this is safe. For a test flight, I accept some contracts to rescue 2 more stranded Kerbinauts. Even with a mainsail engine, the rocket is rather sluggish off the pad. But as it burns off fuel, it picks up more than enough speed to reach a suborbital trajectory. Completely by chance, I launch onto a good encounter with our first stranded Kerbal, and can rendezvous with lots of Delta V to spare. With that, Engineer Cath Kerbin can EVA over to the pod. The launch vehicle wasn't cheap though, and I'd like to get some of that money back, so the Tabby also represents my first attempt at reusable rocketry. I didn't put a probe core on the booster, and even if I did, I would still lose control because I have plasma blackouts enabled, which kill communications during re-entry. Instead, I just set some parachutes to arm on state separation and hope for the best. Unfortunately, it flips backwards during re-entry and the engine melts off, so that's 13,000 funds I'm not getting back. I also put some parachutes on the upper stage, so I'll try to recover that too. You get more funds back from landing vessels closer to the KSC, so I'll aim to re-enter just off the eastern coast. Nothing melts this time, so I'll have the ground crew push it out of the ocean and refuel it for the next launch. Meanwhile, the craft in orbit performs another rendezvous with another stranded Kerbal, rescuing scientist Barry Kerman. Then it's time to get them back to Kerbin for onboarding. And hey, somehow the service module manages to survive re-entry. Turns out this reusable rocketry stuff is pretty easy. Anyways, while that last test flight was mostly successful, it was not even remotely profitable. Which means, you guessed it, time for more survey contracts. This time, the landing site ends up being in this pretty steep crater, so I have to retract a few of the legs to keep it from falling over. Also, as it turns out, I've landed right next to the polar crater again. So this time, I decided to risk it and hop over. After getting some more science and deploying some more surface experiments, I'll decouple the extra crew cabin and lift off. Predictably, the Delta V margin isn't looking too great, so we'll have Engineer Catherine go on EVA and hack off the rest of the landing gear to save mass. Even then, I still ran out of fuel just short of a Kerbin return trajectory. So, in a situation like this, there are 3 options available. Option 1, load my quick save and try again. I have no qualms with doing this, except that having to do the mission over again would take a long time, and I could just run out of fuel again anyways. Option 2, send a rescue mission. That would cost money, and the whole point of this is to make money, so I really don't want to do that either. That leaves us with option 3, get out and push. Because EVA propellant refills whenever a Kerbal boards a vessel, you can technically get unlimited Delta V this way, but it comes with its own punishment. Because the thrust of the jetpack is so low, I had to do this for like 20 minutes just to get my periapsis within the atmosphere. It's even more fun when the pod runs out of electric charge and starts spinning around uncontrollably. But the crew is determined not to get stranded, again, so they eventually make it back to Kerbin. Well, that sucked. Let's not do it again. Instead of sending Kerbals that I have to bring home, I decided to send a probe to get the last few temperature surveys. This is also way cheaper than a crewed mission and can be reused for future contracts, so I'm really not sure why I wasn't doing this ages ago. But regardless, the Lunar Survey Lander 1 earns enough cash to move on to the next phase of my plan. One challenge with getting to Dres lies in its relatively elliptical orbit, meaning that transfer windows can vary pretty wildly in terms of Delta V. The one coming up is the most efficient I could find in the next 10 years or so I don't want to miss it. I'll set it up with the Transfer Window Planner mod as before, but if you don't use mods, there's also a version online with most of the same information. But that does miss out on some features, like being able to add an alarm for the window, or being able to show the parking orbit in the map view like this. I was originally planning on sending a single, giant Apollo-style rocket with both a lander and return capsule, but then I realized that I can't actually launch vehicles over 140 tons with a level 2 launch pad. I really don't feel like grinding out any more money to upgrade it, so to get around this, I'll need to assemble the vessel in orbit over multiple launches. To eject from LKO and capture at Dres, the ship will need about 3,000 meters per second of Delta V. To accomplish this, I've designed an interplanetary transfer stage based on the upper stage of the Tabby, but with a stretched fuel tank and lots of docking ports for expansion. I also tweaked the booster, by offsetting these 4 fuel tanks downwards and adding some heat shields. Because KSP applies the brunt of aerodynamic forces to the first parts in the airstream, these should hopefully protect the engine on re-entry. In addition to being elliptical, Dres's orbit is also inclined. One way to get an encounter is to perform a mid-course plane change, however this can easily cost an extra 1,000 meters per second of Delta V. Instead, I'll launch onto an inclination of 13 degrees from Kerbin, so I can eject onto an inclined orbit without needing any extra fuel. After circularizing at 100 kilometers, let's see how the booster is doing. Apparently, moving those tanks changed the aerodynamics enough that it flies sideways now, but nothing burns up, so I'll consider it a win. However, the transfer stage isn't enough by itself, so I'll need to launch up 2 more. I forgot to add RCS to these, so docking them is a rather involved process. This also isn't helped by those dead zones I mentioned earlier. I could probably fix this with some relay satellites in Kerbin orbit, but instead I just chose to power through it and dock everything together. I also completely forgot to switch to one of the boosters for re-entry, but I remembered the other one. Next, I need a Dres lander. Dres itself is even smaller than the moon, so landing and returning to orbit isn't that much of a challenge. For the task, I'll build the Mouse, a 2-seat lander with the usual slew of experiments, and ample fuel for biome hopping. To launch it, I'll use the same reusable booster you've seen already. The upper stage ends up having some fuel left over, so it can top off the transfer stages before returning to Kerbin. Transferring resources requires a level 2 R&D facility, and because of my difficulty settings, I can only transfer fuel through parts that allow crossfeed, so I'll have to decouple and redock it to refuel. I seem to be getting a weird bug where one of the tanks doesn't want to accept fuel, even though it should be connected, but luckily repositioning to one of the other docking ports works. I'll just hope that doesn't cause any problems later. Finally, it's time to launch the crew. Pilots Gia and Maubert and scientist Merdrin board another Tabby crew vehicle, and dock with the ship in LKO. In addition to carrying the crew to orbit, the Tabby will also perform the return from Dres to Kerbin. With that, all systems are go for the Dres mission. A 1600 meter per second burn from the outer 2 transfer stages puts the ship on a Kerbin escape trajectory and well on its way to Dres. Dres' sphere of influence is tiny, so I don't get an encounter immediately, but that's nothing a small correction burn can't fix. My orbit is inclined about 7 degrees relative to Dres, so I have to position the descending mode to cross over Dres' orbit right as the planet passes by. Once I adjust course, the outer stages are almost empty, so I'll try to undock them. The first one separates without incident, but the other set of ports aren't giving me an option to undock. After doing some digging, I figured out that the ports aren't registering as docked in the first place for some reason, which also seems to be the reason for the fuel transfer bug I was having earlier. After editing my save file to reset them, I can decouple the other stage and carry on. I would like to avoid creating unnecessary space junk, so I'll use the last of the fuel in the discarded stages to put them on a collision course with Dres. While I'm far outside comms range of Kerbin, you can remote control probes from a crewed vessel if they're close enough. Just remember to make sure you're controlling from the right part. I spent like 10 minutes wondering why I couldn't line up the stage's trajectory, until I realized it was facing completely the wrong direction. After a year-long transfer, the tabby and mouse cross in the Dres' sphere of influence, and the crew can get to work collecting science. The third stage is used to capture into a 20-kilometer orbit, where Gia and Maubert can board the lander, while Murdrin stays behind to pilot the return capsule. There's some extra fuel left over in the transfer stage, so I'll use it to deorbit and aim to land the Dres Canyon, seeing as it's generally the most interesting thing on this planet. Then, the mouse begins its final descent. The mouse has landed. With that, Gia and Maubert become the first Kerbal to set foot on Dres. They'll do the usual flag planting ceremonies, then start gathering science. As fun as it would be to set up a breaking ground science base here, it wouldn't be able to connect back to Kerbin, so I'll have to settle for just the normal experiments. After exploring the canyon's biome, I can hop to the highlands nearby and repeat the process. While wandering over to the edge of the canyon to take in the view, I find a large rock formation near the lander. However, it's too big to fit in Maubert's pocket, so I'll just have to leave it be. With some more biome hopping, I'll visit the Midlands, Ridges, Lowlands, and finally the impact craters. By the time it reaches its final landing site, the mouse has just under 500 meters per second of delta V remaining, barely enough to return to orbit. So it's time to get the science and crew back home. Having a pretty low orbital velocity, getting a rendezvous around Dres is not too hard. Using the lander module's built-in RCS thrusters, I'll line up the ports and dock the two craft together. Unlike my last interplanetary voyage, I won't have to wait in orbit for a year, because Kerbin and Dres are already in an optimal return window. Making sure to move the data from the lander to the return pod, I'll undock and leave the mouse to orbit Dres for the rest of time. Then, with one final burn, the tabby ejects from Dres and begins the journey back home to Kerbin. And once again, I've come to the end of the video. The last episode got a lot more attention than I was expecting, so a huge thanks to everyone who stuck around for the wait. Hopefully this was worth it. I've been very busy these past few months, moving to a new apartment and starting a new job, so sorry if you were expecting a consistent upload schedule. More than anything, I think this YouTube stuff is going to be an iterative process, so I'll be listening to feedback and learning as I go. But hey, if you do want to know when I get around to uploading part 3, my sources tell me that there's a big subscribe button you can press down below. Anyways, I'm gonna go play Silksong now. I'll see you all again in 2026.